Hank Grayson leaned against the rusted tailgate of his old Ford pickup, the Texas sun barely cracking the horizon. At 62, he wasn't the man he used to be, and he felt every mile of it. The air smelled faintly of dust and diesel, a ghost of the decades he'd spent hauling freight across the Lone Star State, his rig roaring down I-10 like a beast he'd tamed. Back then, he was king of the highway, broad shoulders, steady hands, a grin that could charm a diner waitress into an extra slice of pecan pie. Now, he was just a guy in a faded flannel, staring at a trailer home that sagged like his spirits, wondering where the hell that Hank had gone. Mornings used to mean something. He'd roll out of his bunk at 4 a.m., the hum of the engine still in his ears, and hit the road with a thermos of black coffee and a sausage biscuit from some gas station dive. The sky would lighten over the flatlands, painting the cotton fields gold, and Hank would feel a live wind in his face. Radio crackling with Waylon Jennings. Every mile of victory. Retirement was supposed to be his reward after 35 years of grinding it out. But 2 years in, those mornings had turned into a slow, suffocating slog he barely recognized. He shuffled inside, the screen door banging shut behind him. The trailer was quiet except for the drone of the TV he'd left on all night, some infomercial about nonstick pans he didn't need. His boots, scuffed and cracked from 1,000 truck stops, sat by the door, untouched for months. Hank didn't bother with breakfast, hadn't in years. Ain't got time for that, he'd mutter, even though time was all he had now. Instead, he flipped on the coffee maker, the gurgle filling the silence as the bitter smell of burnt grounds hit the air. Cup 1 went down fast, scalding his throat. Cup 2 followed before the clock hit 7. By 8, he was on his third, slumped in a lumpy sofa that creaked under his weight. That's where he stayed, parked in front of the TV, channel surfing through reruns of old westerns and weather reports he didn't care about. Hours bled together, the sun climbing higher outside, but Hank didn't move. His back ached, a deep, gnawing pain that started in his spine and radiated down his legs. Too many years in that driver's seat, he'd grumble, popping an ibuprofen he kept in a tin by the remote. He didn't drink water. Coffee was his lifeline, or so he thought. The idea of gulping plain H2O felt like a chore he'd never signed up for. Sleep wasn't much help either. He'd roll out of bed at 9, sometimes 10, the mattress sagging where he'd tossed all night. First thing he'd do? Grab his phone, scroll through emails he wouldn't answer, news he wouldn't read, texts from his daughter, Lisa, he'd reply to later. The screen's glow stung his eyes, but he kept at it, thumbs swiping like it was muscle memory. Sunlight? He didn't bother. The blinds stayed shut, the trailer dim and stale. Exercise? Forget it. The most he moved was to the fridge for a donut or a cold slice of pizza. Breakfast, lunch, whatever. Meditation? Yoga? He'd laugh if anyone suggested it. That's for city folks with too much time, he'd say, though he had plenty of time and nothing to show for it. But it wasn't just the aches or the laziness that got to him. It was the fog. Hank's mind, once sharp enough to memorize every exit from Amarillo to El Paso, was slipping. Last week, he'd stood in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, and blanked on the name of Dusty's Diner, a truck stop he'd hit 100 times, where the hash browns were greasy perfection and the jukebox played Hank Williams. He could see it, the red neon sign, the chipped counter, but the name? Gone. He'd shaken it off, blamed it on a late night, but it stuck with him, a splinter he couldn't pull out. Then there was Billy, his grandson, 9 years old, all freckles and wild energy, who'd show up with a football and those big, hopeful eyes. Come on, Grandpa, let's play. He'd beg. Hank wanted to God. He did. He'd toss the ball a few times, grinning at Billy's whoops, but his back would seize up, his breath would catch, and he'd wave the kid off. Not today, bud. Grandpa's tired. Billy's smile would fade, and Hank would feel it like a punch, the shame of letting him down, the fear that tired was all he'd ever be. That morning, as he sank deeper into the sofa, the TV blaring about a cold front he wouldn't feel, something snapped. He reached for his coffee, 4th cup now, and fumbled it. The mug hit the floor, shattering into jagged pieces, the black sludge pooling on the linoleum. Hank cursed, hauling himself up to grab a rag, but his legs buckled. He caught the armrest just in time, heart pounding, sweat beading on his forehead. What the hell's wrong with me? He rasped, sinking back down. He stared at the mess, the TV's drone fading into static in his ears. This wasn't just age. This was something else, something he'd done to himself. Hank didn't know it yet, but those mornings were killing him. 9 habits, quiet as a rattlesnake in the brush, were sinking their fangs in after 60. The science backs it up. Mayo Clinic says skipping breakfast slows your metabolism to a crawl, while the American Heart Association warns sitting too long turns your heart into a ticking bomb. Too much coffee. European Food Safety Authority says it's dehydrating you dry. No water, sleeping in, phone obsession, no sun, no movement, no calm. They're a slow poison, especially past 60. But Hank didn't read studies. He just lived it, one creaky sunrise at a time. He rubbed his eyes, the fog thicker than ever, and thought back to the road. The smell of diesel, the hum of tires on asphalt, the way he'd roll into a truck stop with his head high. That Hank could have wrestled a steer, or at least a flat tire in one. This Hank couldn't wrestle a coffee mug. He glanced out the window, the pickup sitting there like a relic of who he'd been. "I ain't dead yet," he muttered, but it sounded more like a question than a fact. The TV flickered, some ad about miracle pills he didn't trust. Hank snorted, but a thought wormed in. What if it's not just age? What if it's me? 9 morning habits: no breakfast, too much coffee, sitting like a lump, no water, late starts, phone first, no sun, no exercise, no peace were dragging him down a road he didn't want to take. At 62, that road was getting short, fast. He didn't have answers, not yet. But as he watched Billy kick a ball in the yard next door through the dusty blinds, a spark flickered. Maybe he could still turn the wheel. And what about you? Those mornings you stumble through, skipping meals, chugging coffee, glued to screens. Do you ever stop to think what they're doing to you? Especially if you're over 60 or staring it down. Hank didn't until it almost broke him. Stick with me here, because this Texas trucker's about to find out what's really killing him and how to fight back before it's too late. So here's the question. Are you quietly hurting yourself every morning without even knowing it? Hank Grayson sat behind the wheel of his old Ford pickup, the engine rumbling like a tired dog as he pulled out of the trailer park. The Texas sun was climbing, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt, and the air smelled of dry earth and mesquite. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 days after he'd shattered that coffee mug and nearly gone down with it. The memory still stung his legs, giving out, the cold sweat, the way he'd clung to the sofa like a lifeline. At 62, he'd brushed off a lot: aches, fog, the slow creep of age, but that moment shook him. He wasn't just tired. He was falling apart. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd loaded the truck of his own ruin. He flipped on the radio, more out of habit than hope, skipping past static and twangy guitar riffs until a voice cut through. It was one of those health shows, some doctor with a smooth drawl talking about aging smart. Hank snorted, reaching to change it, but the guy's next words froze his hand. "After 60, your mornings can kill you if you're not careful," the doc said, all calm and serious. 9 habits, little things you don't even think about, are digging your grave slow and quiet. Hank's jaw tightened. He turned up the volume, the pickup rattling along the empty road to the hardware store. Number 1, the doc went on, skipping breakfast. Mayo Clinic says it slows your metabolism to a crawl, sets you up for diabetes. Hank's stomach growled, empty as usual. He hadn't eaten a real breakfast since his trucking days. Coffee was king back then, and it still ruled now. 2, too much coffee. European Food Safety Authority warns it dehydrates you, taxes your heart. Hank glanced at the empty to-go cup in the console, his third that morning, black and bitter. 3, sitting too long. American Heart Association says it's like shutting off your ticker every hour cuts your life shorter. Hank shifted uncomfortably, his back throbbing from hours on that sofa. The list kept coming, each one a jab to the gut. 4, no water. National Kidney Foundation says your kidneys take the hit. Dehydration's a silent killer after 60. Hank licked his dry lips, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a glass. 5. Sleeping in. National Sleep Foundation says it throws your body clock haywire, messes with your energy. He'd rolled out at 9:30 today, normal for him. 6. Phone first thing. Psychology Today says it spikes your stress before you're even awake. Hank's thumb twitched, thinking of the news alerts he'd scrolled through in bed. 7. No sunlight. Harvard Health says you're starving your bones and mood without vitamin D. The blinds in his trailer hadn't budged in months. 8. No movement. Mayo Clinic says your muscles waste away, use M or lose M. Hank's legs felt like lead just thinking about it. 9. No calm. National Institutes of Health says skipping meditation or quiet time ramps up anxiety, fries your brain. Hank laughed a short, bitter bark. Meditation? I'd sooner wrestle a longhorn. He pulled into the hardware store lot, the radio still humming as he killed the engine. 9 habits. 9 things he did every damn morning without a second thought. The doc's voice echoed. After 60, your body doesn't forgive like it used to. These aren't quirks, they're a death sentence in slow motion. Hank sat there, hands gripping the wheel, the words sinking in like gravel in his boots. Diabetes? Heart trouble? Kidney failure? His mind spun, landing on Dusty's Diner, the name he couldn't recall last week. Was that part of this too? He climbed out, the pickup door groaning, and headed inside for a new water jug for his dog, Rusty. The aisle smelled of paint and sawdust, a faint echo of the garages he'd known on the road. He grabbed a 5-gallon jug light enough, he figured, and hoisted it off the shelf. That's when it hit. A sharp, searing pain shot through his lower back, like a knife twisting in his spine. The jug slipped, crashing to the floor with a hollow thud, water glugging out in a puddle around his boots. Hank staggered, grabbing a shelf, his breath ragged. Son of a, he hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. A clerk rushed over. You all right, sir? Hank waved him off, gruff but shaken. Fine. Just fine. He wasn't fine. He hobbled back to the truck, leaving the mess behind, and sank into the driver's seat. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, the pain still pulsing. That jug wasn't heavy, 20 pounds, tops. He'd hauled 50-pound tires without blinking in his 40s. Now, he couldn't lift a damn water jug without folding. He thought of Billy, begging him to play ball, and Lisa, who'd called last week worried about his cough. What if he couldn't keep up? What if he couldn't be there? The radio doc's words clawed at him, slow and quiet, killing you. Back home, Hank sat at his kitchen table, a wobbly thing he'd meant to fix for years, and grabbed a napkin. With a pen from the junk drawer, he scribbled down what he'd heard. 1. No breakfast. 2. Too much coffee. 3. Sitting. 4. No water. 5. Sleeping in. 6. Phone. 7. No sun. 8. No exercise. 9. No calm. He stared at the list, each word a mirror he didn't want to look into. This is me, he muttered, voice low. Every single one. The science wasn't lying. American Diabetes Association said no breakfast spiked his blood sugar. Harvard Health warned no sun was hollowing his bones. His back, his brain, his breath, it all lined up. He crumpled the napkin, then smoothed it out. Okay, he said to the empty trailer, the TV still droning in the background. Maybe I'm in deep. But knowing it was one thing, fixing it was a haul he wasn't sure he could make. He wasn't some gym rat or health nut. He was Hank Grayson, truck driver, coffee junkie, king of the couch. Change sounded like a mountain he didn't have the gear to climb. Still, that jug slipping, that pain, it stuck with him. Billy's hopeful eyes stuck with him. He couldn't keep rolling down this road. Hey, if you're watching this right now, let's hit the brakes for a sec. Drop a 2 in the comments below if you're with me this far, and tell me, which of these 9 habits are you guilty of? Skipping breakfast? Too much coffee? Sitting till your back screams? I'm dying to know. Hit me up down there, because Hank's not alone on this ride, and I bet you've got some stories too. That night, Hank lay in bed, the trailer creaking as a wind kicked up outside. The radio replayed in his head, a loop he couldn't shut off. He pictured himself a year from now, 65, maybe stuck in that sofa, forgetting more than diner names, too weak to toss a ball with Billy. His chest tightened. I ain't there yet, he growled, fists clenching the sheets. I can't be. But the truth was a headlight in the fog. Those 9 morning habits weren't just ruts. They were chains, pulling him toward a ditch he might not crawl out of. By 3 a.m., he'd made up his mind. He didn't know how, didn't know if he'd stick it, but he had to try. Something. Anything. Because if he didn't stop now, the next load he dropped might not be a jug, it might be him. The question burned, bright and hard. If you're over 60 or close, do you see yourself in me? Hank didn't like the answer. But he wasn't ready to jackknife just yet. Hank Grayson woke to the buzz of his alarm clock, a cheap thing he dug out of a drawer and set for 6:30 a.m. The Texas dawn was still a faint glow through the trailer's blinds, and for a moment, he wanted to slap the snooze button and sink back into the sagging mattress. At 62, sleeping in was his default 9, 10, sometimes later, but not today. That jug slipping at the hardware store 3 days ago, the stab of pain in his back, the radio doc's voice listing those 9 morning killers, it all stuck to him like road tar. Hank wasn't a quitter. He'd driven through blizzards, fixed flats in the rain, kept his rig rolling when the odds said stop. If he could fight for that, he could fight for this. For himself. For Billy. He swung his legs over the bed, the floor cool under his calloused feet, and shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee maker sat there, a dented relic from his trucking days, daring him to fire it up. Not yet, he growled, turning away. Step 1, breakfast. The doc had said skipping it was a fast track to diabetes. American Diabetes Association wasn't messing around, and Hank wasn't about to roll those dice. He cracked 2 eggs into a skillet, the sizzle filling the trailer with a smell he'd forgotten he loved. A slice of toast, real bread, not the donut crap he'd been living on. He sat at the wobbly table, fork in hand, and dug in. It wasn't fancy, but it hit his stomach like fuel in an empty tank. Huh, he grunted, surprised. Maybe this wasn't so bad. Next, moving. Mayo Clinic said no exercise turned your muscles to mush, and Hank's back was proof. He wasn't about to run a marathon his knees would laugh him off the block, but a walk. He could swing that. He laced up his old boots, the leather stiff but loyal, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint sweetness of mesquite bushes dotting the trailer park. He started slow, past the neighbor's yapping mutt, past the rusted mailbox he'd been meaning to fix. 10 minutes in, his legs griped, but it was a good ache, the kind that said they weren't done yet. He pushed to 15, looping back with a sheen of sweat on his brow. Take that, Doc, he muttered, a smirk tugging at his lips. Water was the hard part. Hank hated it, tasted like nothing, felt like a punishment. But the National Kidney Foundation had scared him straight. No water was frying his insides, and that jug fumble wasn't a fluke. He filled a glass from the tap, stared at it like it was a rattlesnake, and chugged. It went down cold and plain, but his mouth didn't feel like sandpaper anymore. One down, he told himself, setting a jug by the sink. Baby steps. He'd get to the 2 liters they preached about later. The rest of the day wasn't smooth sailing. Coffee withdrawal hit like a jackhammer. 2 cups instead of 4 left him with a headache that thumped behind his eyes. He caught himself reaching for his phone first thing, thumb hovering over the news app, but stopped. Not today, he growled, tossing it onto the couch. Sunlight. He cracked the blinds, let the morning rays spill across the linoleum. No yoga or meditation, yet Hank wasn't ready to sit cross-legged like some yoga guru, but he'd tackled 3, maybe 4 of those 9 habits. It was a start. The real test came that afternoon. Billy burst through the door, football in hand, his sneakers tracking dirt across the floor. Grandpa, let's play, he hollered, tossing the ball at Hank's chest. Hank's gut clenched. He wasn't ready, his back still twinged. His legs felt like jelly from the walk, but those eyes, bright and begging, wouldn't let him say no. All right, bud, he said, hauling himself up. Let's see what I've got. They stepped into the yard, the grass patchy and brown from the Texas heat. Billy threw a wild pass, the ball spiraling left. Hank lumbered after it, slow as a 3-legged dog, but he didn't stop. He snagged it, tossed it back, grinning as Billy hooped. 5 throws, then 10. His breath came short, his back grumbled, but he stayed upright. After the 10th, Billy tackled him in a hug, laughing. "You're tougher than last time, Grandpa." Hank's throat tightened, and he ruffled the kid's hair. "Not tough yet, kid," he rasped. "Just getting there." That night, Hank sank into his sofa not to rot, but to think. He pulled out that napkin, the ink smudged from his sweaty grip. No breakfast, too much coffee, sitting, no water, sleeping in, phone, no sun, no exercise, no calm. He'd scratched at 4 breakfast, a walk, water, early rise. 5 to go. It wasn't a cakewalk. He missed the buzz of coffee, the lazy scroll, the late mornings. But then he thought of Billy's hug, the way his grandson's face lit up. He thought of that walk, the mesquite in the air, the sun on his face. He felt it a shift, like a rig finding its gear after a long stall. A week in, something clicked. He was out on his walk 20 minutes now, not 15 when he passed the cotton field down the road, the white tufts swaying in the breeze. A name hit him, Dusty's Diner. Clear as a bell. The red sign, the greasy hash browns, the jukebox crooning "You're cheatin'," heart it all flooded back. Hank stopped, boots crunching gravel, and grinned like a fool. He remembered. No fumbling, no fog, just Dusty's. The eggs, the walk, the water, it was working. His brain wasn't fixed, not yet, but it was firing up. He wasn't there yet. Sleeping at 10 p.m. to hit 6:30 was a beast. He'd stare at the ceiling, counting cracks till midnight. Meditation? He tried it once, sitting still for 5 minutes, and nearly dozed off. Yoga? He'd watched a video, stretched like a rusty hinge, and quit when his knee popped. But those wins: breakfast every day, 20 minutes on his feet, a glass of water instead of a 5th coffee, they piled up. His back didn't ache as deep. His hands steadied. And Billy? That kid was his diesel, keeping him rolling. Hank leaned back, the sofa quieter now, like it was rooting for him. He wasn't the trucker of his 40s, barreling down the highway with a full load and a full tank. But he wasn't the wreck of a week ago either, crumbling under coffee stains and TV static. He was in between, fighting his way back. 1 mile at a time, he whispered, the napkin crinkling in his fist. It sank in then, sharp and true. He didn't need a full overhaul, just a turn of the wheel. One habit, then another. He could do this. And you? You don't need to flip your life upside down, just nudge the wheel. Maybe it's eggs tomorrow. Maybe it's a 5-minute walk. Whatever it is, it's yours to claim. Because if Hank can haul himself out of this ditch, if this old gearhead can shift lanes, you can too. The question's staring you down. What's your first turn? Hank Grayson stood in the driveway of his Texas trailer, the sun cresting over the horizon, painting the sky a fiery orange. 3 months had passed since he'd started this haul, 3 months since that water jug slipped and his back screamed, since the radio doc's words lit a fuse under him. At 62, he'd been running on fumes, his mornings a slow grind of 9 habits that were quietly killing him after 60. Now, as the mesquite-scented breeze rustled his flannel, he felt the engine kick over. Not the pickups, the one inside him. He wasn't just idling anymore. He was rolling. It hadn't been a straight shot. Those first weeks were rough. Swapping coffee for water felt like trading diesel for dishwater. And waking at 6:30 was a fistfight with his own eyelids. But Hank was a trucker at heart, built for the long haul, not the quick fix. He'd stuck with it, 1 mile at a time. Breakfast became a ritual. Eggs, toast, sometimes a scoop of oatmeal with a drizzle of honey he'd picked up at the farmer's market. Mayo Clinic said it fired up his metabolism, and damn if he didn't feel it, energy that didn't crash by noon. Coffee, down to 1 cup, savored slow, not guzzled like a lifeline. The European Food Safety Authority was right: less caffeine, less shake in his hands. Walking turned into a habit he craved. What started as 15 minutes stretched to 45, his boots kicking up dust past the cotton fields and rusted trailers. American Heart Association swore it kept his ticker pumping, and his back, once a knot of pain, loosened up, steady enough to carry him. Water? He hit 2 liters a day now, a jug always within reach, lemon slices floating in it to kill the boredom. National Kidney Foundation wasn't kidding. His head felt clearer, his skin less like cracked leather. Sleeping in was history. 6:30 a.m. sharp. No excuses, the National Sleep Foundation's rhythm syncing his days. The phone stayed off till after breakfast. Psychology Today's warning about stress ringing true. His mornings felt calmer without the screen's glare. Sunlight. He soaked it in. 15 minutes on the porch with his coffee. Harvard Health's vitamin D promise lifting the fog from his bones and mood. Exercise grew from walks to push-ups, 10 at first. Then 20. Mayo Clinic's muscle mantra proving itself as his arms stopped trembling. And calm. He'd grudgingly tried meditation, 10 minutes of deep breaths, eyes closed, picturing I-10 stretching endless ahead. National Institutes of Health said it cut anxiety, and Hank felt the knots in his chest unwind. Yoga came last, a stiff stretch from a YouTube video, his knees popping but holding. He was no guru, but he was moving. The payoff hit like a freight train one Saturday morning. Billy showed up, football swapped for a baseball glove, his grin wide as the horizon. "Grandpa, let's play catch," he shouted, tossing a ball Hank's way. Hank caught it, the leather smacking his palm, and grinned back. "You're on, bud." They headed to the yard, the sun high and hot, and started tossing. 5 throws, 10, 20. Hank's breath stayed even, his back didn't buckle, his legs held strong. 30 minutes in, no wheezing, no collapse. He was still going, laughing as Billy dove for a wild pitch. "You're a pro, Grandpa," Billy yelled, tackling him in a hug. Hank's eyes burned, and he blinked hard, ruffling the kid's hair. "Not a pro, kid," he rasped. "Just back in the game." That was the moment. Standing there, sweat on his brow, the Texas sun blazing down, Hank broke wide open. Tears slipped out not from pain, but from something bigger. He'd done it. He'd hauled himself out of the ditch past the fog, the aches, the near miss with that jug. Billy's arms around him, the ball rolling in the dirt. It was more than a game. It was proof. 3 months ago, he couldn't lift 20 pounds without folding. Now, he was playing catch like he hadn't in years, strong enough to keep up, alive enough to feel it. Later that day, he sat at the kitchen table, the wobbly leg finally fixed with a wrench and some grit. The napkin was long gone, replaced by a new list scratched onto a piece of plywood he'd found in the shed. 1. Eat breakfast, fuel upright. 2. Walk 45, keep the engine running. 3. Drink water 2 liters, no skimping. 4. Wake early 6:30 sharp. 5. Skip the phone, start calm. 6. Get sun 15 minutes minimum. 7. Move more push-ups, stretches, anything. 8. Meditate 10 minutes of quiet. 9. Yoga bend, don't break. He nailed it to the wall, a roadmap of his comeback. The trailer park noticed. Old man Jenkins, who smoked on his stoop every morning, caught Hank on a walk. "You're looking like you could haul freight again, Grayson," he said, half joking. Hank shrugged, but his chest swelled. He started leaving notes, copies of his 9 habits, scribbled on scraps, and slipped under doors. A week later, Jenkins waved him down. "Tried the water thing. Ain't half bad," he grunted. Hank nodded, gruff but proud. "Told ya." The real high came a month later. Lisa called, her voice bright. "Dad, Billy's got a game. Come watch, he wants you there." Hank hadn't been to a little league field in years, too tired, too sore. But now, he drove the pickup, the engine purring smoother since he'd tinkered with it, and parked by the bleachers. Billy spotted him, waved like a maniac, and Hank waved back, settling in. The kid hit a double, and Hank cheered, his voice carrying over the crowd. After, Billy ran over, glove dangling. "Grandpa, you're loud." He laughed. Hank grinned, throat tight. "Gotta be, bud." That night, under the trailer's porch light, Hank stood tall. The air smelled of dust and freedom. He wasn't the trucker of his 40s, barreling down highways with a full load and a swagger. But he wasn't the shell of 3 months ago either, sinking under coffee stains and TV drone. He was Hank Grayson, 62, weathered, fierce, and kicking. He'd found more than health. He'd found his road again. Here's the truth. It's not over at 60, not for Hank. Not for you. 9 habits nearly ran him off the asphalt, skipping breakfast, drowning in coffee, sitting still, dodging water, sleeping late, scrolling early, hiding from sun, skipping movement, ignoring calm. But 9 new ones pulled him back. American Diabetes Association says breakfast keeps your blood sugar steady. Mayo Clinic says movement saves your muscles. National Institutes of Health says calm saves your mind. It's real, it's science, and it's yours to grab. Hank stopped before it was too late barely. You don't have to wait for the crash. Start small. Eggs instead of nothing, a walk instead of the couch, water instead of a fifth cup. Don't let 60 be the end of your road, it's just a turn. Hank's proof. 3 months, 9 habits, one hell of a comeback. He didn't just survive, he roared back to life. The question's yours now. Where are you steering your mornings? Don't wait for the jug to drop. Take the wheel. Hank did. You can too.